Hi, everyone. Good to see you all popping in. Welcome to the session serving people with complex needs. My name is Anastasia, and I'm your moderator. We'll get started in just a minute, but just a couple of things to mention first. First, immediately following this, there is a lunch break. That lunch break is from 12:35 to 1 p.m. Eastern, and then you'll come back for your next sessions. Next, the presenters for the session have told us that, or have asked us to hold questions until the end. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can put it in chat at any time during the talk. I'll keep track of them and bring them back for the Q&A portion. And last, if you're having any technical issues or need support, let us know in the chat. We've got conference services here and also try to help any way I can. All right, with that, let's meet the presenters. First, Pat Fitfield is a frontline harm reduction worker and educator with almost a decade of experience, having started as an outreach worker in a needle exchange and having spent nearly 5 years working in one of Toronto's first supervised consumption sites. For the last 2 years, Pat has been employed as a harm reduction coordinator with the City of Toronto's iFair program, working with clients in the emergency shelter system and providing harm reduction training to shelter staff and residents. Pat has also been active in advocacy around homelessness and anti-poverty initiatives. And next, Kelly White is manager of harm reduction programs and founded the overdose prevention site at Street Health at Dundas and Sherbourne in Toronto. This is the intersection of the second highest number of calls to 911 for overdose in the entire city. She is a graduate of the University of Toronto who has been involved in grassroots struggles for social justice and frontline work with people who are marginalized for many years. Kelly's lived experience with drug use and treatment informs her approach to program development and supporting staff. All right, with that, I'll pass it over to you and we'll get started.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. So as the intro said, we've been asked to speak to you a little bit today about supporting people with complex needs. Pat and I both work at Street Health and have for some time, and we'd just like to tell you a little bit about the approach that we've developed working with folks with high needs. We do not have any conflict of interest to declare other than the fact that we both received support from Street Health in preparing this presentation today. We did want to start with a land acknowledgement, especially considering how disproportionately Indigenous folks are affected by issues like the drug poisoning crisis and homelessness. So we would like to acknowledge that we are speaking to you from the traditional and ancestral territories of Indigenous people, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. So-called Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. The criminalization of drugs is rooted in racism and colonialism, and as a result, Black and Indigenous communities have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs. The war on drugs has led to police violence, racialized mass incarceration, and tens of thousands of preventable overdose deaths due to a toxic drug supply. Acknowledging territory should take place within the larger context of genuine and ongoing work to forge real understanding and to challenge ongoing settler colonial violence. Every individual and institution has a role to play in making the changes needed to dismantle systemic racism against Black and Indigenous people in Canada. So as I said, we come to you from an organization called Street Health. So Street Health has been providing health and social services to folks who are homeless, folks who are street involved since 1986. So we've developed a bit of a framework that works well when we are serving folks who are really in survival mode and who are dealing with many intersecting challenges. Over the past 38 years, we have sort of developed a way of designing our programs and services that works for people who are dealing with very complex, multifaceted issues in their life. So we just wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. So Street Health started with a group of nurses, but has since evolved into many services. So a few examples of those services are ID replacement and storage, nursing care, kit making, which is a program that employs folks from the neighborhood to create harm reduction kits with sterile supplies, drop-ins. So one thing that's really become more of a challenge as the housing crisis in Toronto has gotten worse is simply spaces for people to be. So we find that our clients are chased out of parks, they're given tickets for congregating in alleys, things like that. So providing drop-ins with supportive services and meals and things like that is really key. We do have an overdose prevention site, which is, these go by many names: supervised consumption site, consumption and treatment services. We call ours an overdose prevention site, but this is essentially a space where people can use drugs under supervision and get connected to emergency care if anything goes wrong, but most importantly, support and referrals to other services. We do case management for people with severe and persistent mental health issues. We have a community care project, which employs people from the community to clean up discarded harm reduction supplies. While we were designed and founded, as I said, to serve homeless people, there's a major intersection with substance use, and many of the people who come to us for support and care are finding that their substance use is a major challenge in their lives. So just again, coming back to serving people with complex needs. So as I said, while people from all walks of life use substances, folks who are already marginalized or struggle with the negative consequences of their substance use in a very intense way. So many people who use drugs or opioids specifically are also dealing with these challenges. So we're talking about things like housing instability, mental health challenges, insufficient income to meet basic needs. So I think most of us probably know that there's a major disconnect between the levels of income support that people get and the actual costs of the housing market, especially, but all basic needs. Polysubstance use of a toxic drug supply, and a lack of social support. So again, over the past 38 years, our organization has really developed a facility and an expertise in serving people with complex needs. And I think in addition to folks struggling with homelessness, many of the principles can apply to lots of people who are struggling with drug use. So just to remind us, to emphasize that the intersection issues that I talked about, so a lack of social support, a lack of housing, mental health challenges, can really make it difficult or impossible to do a lot of the things that we take for granted when it comes to accessing healthcare. So we find that even something as simple as keeping your health card safe is really challenging for people. Making and keeping appointments. So if you think about many of our people who don't have access to a phone, for example, attending daily pharmacy visits, which is a requirement of many formulations of opioid agonist treatment, making informed choices about substance use, and a number of other things that, again, many of us take for granted when it comes to accessing healthcare. So the mainstream healthcare system is really not designed to meet the needs of many of the folks that we serve and many people who are experiencing multiple complex issues in their lives. So Street Health over time has needed to develop and implement a philosophy of care to mitigate these challenges. And we're just going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. So over time, as we've kind of, it's really, as many things, a process of trial and error, but over time we've learned sort of some common themes that run throughout all of our programs and services that seem to work best for the folks we serve. So there's a real focus on reducing barriers to access for our clients. So for example, we don't require an appointment to access services as much as possible. We go to the spaces where people are. We make our own space as welcoming as possible, trying our best to sort of be a one-stop shop for a variety of care needs. So people may come to see a nurse practitioner, for example, but while they are on site, they have the opportunity to learn about, applying for a health card and keeping it safe. We serve as a mailing address for folks, for example. We have mental health case managers who can really work on longer term relationship building with people and managing their case. Just a variety of services that try to meet people's needs. We also try to make every effort to ensure that clients are fully informed about all of their options, really focusing on using language that they can understand, and trying to encourage people to make their own, identify their own priorities and make their own goals based on those priorities. So again, many of our clients are very much in survival mode. They may be living on the street. They may not have slept in several days. So we try to meet people where they're at. So what is this philosophy of care? So all of the things I just mentioned have some conceptual themes in common. So I think when a lot of people think about harm reduction, a lot of people are familiar with needle and syringe exchange. They're familiar with supervised consumption sites. They're familiar with ideas like safer supply. But what is the conceptual framework that all of these types of services have in common? So they're low barrier, they're client-centered, and based in harm reduction. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to actually operationalize some of these concepts in sort of day-to-day service provision. So we, again, utilize these principles because we have learned that they work. We have learned that I think our services serve as kind of the last rung and kind of the social safety net for many people. So a lot of our folks are, attending the emergency room for healthcare. They don't have somebody to look after them ongoing, really just kind of living day to day. So some of the, the reason why we do these things in this way is to meet people's needs and try to get them coming back. So Pat, I'll let you speak a little bit about, again, the 5 key principles that make services client-centered, low barrier, and harm reduction based.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So yeah, as Kelly kind of pointed out on the previous slides there, Street Health has developed a philosophy of care that's grounded in meeting the needs of a population that has a lot of complex and intersecting challenges. So this philosophy has come out of necessity. It's based on our attempts to provide healthcare services to folks who may have difficulty accessing them in a quote unquote traditional model. So we've kind of identified one primary principle that drives serving people with complex needs, and that's keep them coming back. Like, we want to develop relationships of trust with our clients who may have had negative experiences with the healthcare system in the past. So we need to be able to develop relationships of trust where clients feel like they can confide in us, and that we will be able to work with them to address some of the challenges and needs that are present in their lives. So the big overarching goal has always been to keep them coming back, develop a relationship of trust such that people feel that they will continue to access services with us over a period of time. Not just a one and done kind of scenario, where people feel like they can continue to come back to Street Health, and that we will be able to at least begin to address some of the complex needs that are present in their lives. And so we've kind of tried to break down this philosophy of care into 5 principles that we try to implement in our client staff interactions. And these are the kind of 5 key principles with harm reduction philosophy of care. And these are being non-judgmental, a non-judgmental perspective, knowledge sharing, client-centric approach, incrementalism, and consistency. So we're going to look at some of these principles over the next couple of slides. And we strive to implement these principles on a on on an individual basis when working with clients. These are the overarching kind of principles that drive our philosophy and that we try to implement on a client-staff interaction. So the first one I want to take a closer look at is a non-judgmental perspective. And I think like the first kind of useful way to unpack this is to differentiate between what we might call a moral judgment and a practical judgment. When we talk about judging behavior, we it's useful to conceptualize it as with a moral dimension and a practical dimension. The moral dimension just sees behavior as an absolute. It's good or it's bad, it's right or it's wrong, etc. Whereas a practical judgment tries to see the behavior in context, in situ, as a component of a client's life. So, it's easy to make the leap from the moral judgment that using fentanyl is bad, therefore I'm a bad person for using fentanyl, and there's nowhere to build on with that. There's nowhere else to go. That's just a statement of fact, and a client may feel like that there's someone who adopts that perspective may not see the reality of their situation or see the situation in all its complexity. So I find in adopting a practical perspective, to adopt a non-judgmental perspective in dealing with clients, it's helpful to differentiate between problematic and non-problematic substance use. Problematic substance use may get in the way of other goals or other parts of a client's life, whereas non-problematic substance use, it might just be a preference that is in itself neither inherently good or bad. Framing substance use in this way puts the focus on the client, on their goals, what they want to achieve, and how we can help them do so. And adopting that perspective, then we find that it's much more likely that clients are going to continue accessing services because they know that we're not going to take a position where we judge them or their behaviors as absolutely good or bad. Because people use drugs for a wide variety of reasons. We can't presume to know all the reasons that compel someone to use. And so moral judgments on substance use kind of ignore the dimension in favor of blanket statements about a complex and multifaceted behavior. That kind of risks alienating clients and offers, like I said, nowhere to build. There's nowhere else to go on that. So I think it's a useful way to unpack this and just kind of as an example. So let's take a hypothetical person, like someone named Fran, say. Fran's a daily fentanyl user. They mostly use fentanyl in the context of supervised consumption sites. They utilize new equipment. Their substance use isn't having a major impact on other aspects of their life. Whereas if, Fran was constantly overdosing, was spending all their money on drugs such that they were broke and unable to access other things, that substance use would then maybe shift from being non-problematic to problematic. So a non-judgmental perspective puts the focus on looking at the behavior in context and asking how is it impacting a client's life, and not adopting a kind of all or nothing, yes or no, black and white kind of perspective on substance use.
Yeah.
So the next, sorry, go ahead, go.
Sorry, I just wanted to chime in a little bit there. I think something that I've learned also over, close to a decade of working with people who use drugs is just how much some of these moralistic, absolutist judgments are internalized by people. So people can very much, really believe that they're a bad person for using fentanyl, for example. And I think trying to really gently push back against this and say, well, what function is this serving in your life? Is something that can be useful for folks to think about. But really being non-judgmental is the core of developing the relationships of care that harm reduction is founded in. Thank you, Pat.
Thanks. So the next principle we want to look at is knowledge sharing. And this might sound a little amorphous, but I think it is a really important grounding principle for our philosophy of care, because you will see the world that people use drugs inhabit often brushes up against really complicated topics in medicine and science. We see this in, recently with the proliferation of adulterants in Toronto's drug supply. There's a lot of new drugs that are showing up nitazene opioids, novel benzodiazepines, veterinary medicines, stuff like that. Things that will certainly impact the lives of people who use drugs, but they may not have up-to-date, accurate information about some of these substances. So being able to provide accurate, up-to-date, reliable information is a really crucial component of making informed decisions. And we want to empower clients to be able to make those informed decisions that are meaningful and relevant to their own lives. So when you couple that ability to offer meaningful, accurate, empirical information with that non-judgmental approach, it's often the case that you can kind of come to be viewed as a resource, as someone who, people feel comfortable bringing questions or concerns to and getting your feedback and getting your opinion and information on. And, this actually, it works on the individual level in that so much as you're, providing clients with good information that allows them to make informed decisions, but also it has a kind of a ripple effect too, right? A lot of the ways that people who use drugs propagate information or knowledge are through kind of informal networks. There's something similar, in sociologists have identified talking about things like whisper networks, those kind of informal associations among people that allow them to share information and propagate knowledge, across a relatively contained group. And a lot of people who use drugs, we find that information circulates a lot that way. So if you're able to provide accurate, reliable information to someone else, they're often able to pass it on, and they pass it on, and they pass it on. So it does have like a compounding kind of ripple effect in that, you're providing good information to an individual, and that information often does find its way out to other parts of the community. So good empirical information grounded in a non-judgmental perspective is a crucial first step towards setting realistic goals. And that is itself part and parcel of the client-centric approach, which is actually the next principle we kind of want to move on to here.
I think too, something that harm reduction often brushes up against is the fact that, especially when it comes to the street drug supply, we seem to be playing catch up a lot of the time, right? So you may not have all of the answers to what the latest nitazene that's showing up in people's fentanyl is going to do to them. But it's simply being open to hearing about these things and committing to look for further information can really go a long way for people opening up and again, building relationships of trust.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to pass this one over to Kelly, I think, to do a little discussion on client-centric care.
Yep. Thank you so much. So again, a major theme of the experiences that we've had over time with folks who are street involved, marginalized, using drugs, is that people often feel that the traditional healthcare system either talks down to them, judges them, or will never possibly understand the context of the life they're living in. This disconnect that people perceive can make goal setting when it comes to treatment seem very difficult, especially when what we see as ideal outcomes, which, maybe abstinence, for example, just seem totally impossible or unrealistic considering the circumstances people are living in. So for someone who's facing myriad obstacles, it can be difficult for them to come up with a set of goals together with the treatment provider. And unfortunately, that can make treatment seem either pointless or disempowering. Harm reduction really aims to meet people where they're at. So our goal is to encourage people to set their own goals around their substance use based on the circumstances of their life. And again, as Pat said, based on the best possible information that we can provide for them, provided in a way that they can understand. So imposing a one-size-fits-all approach, which is unfortunately quite common in healthcare, we're trying to provide services to everybody, the general population, can really risk alienating the kinds of clients that we're talking about and lead to important details getting lost. So we really try at Street Health to tailor our services to the individual as much as we can. using a collaborative approach that emphasizes, again, the individual goals of the client, which can be very different from person to person. One person's goal may be total abstinence. One person's goal may be using at a supervised consumption site every time they use. Another person's goal may be, being stabilized enough on OAT to only use in the evenings or something like that. So when we emphasize that all of these goals are perfectly reasonable and goals that we can work towards together with our clients, it helps to build trust with people, circumvent the obstacles that we talked about, and empower clients to really meaningfully engage with their care. A top-down approach really does not work with the kind of folks we're talking about, and it's really, really important to encourage them to realize that they are in fact driving the treatment. It's about them. It's about their life. It's about their goal. So clients are the experts on their own lives. We aim to support them in achieving what they deem important. We don't tell them what their goals should be or presume we understand their situation better than they do. Again, very useful to think of the treatment process as a collaboration. So we're encouraging the client to define what's meaningful to them. And we keep in mind that we will never have the complete access to the story of this person's life. We hope that through a non-judgmental approach and a client-centered approach, that the client will let us into their story over time, trust us enough to share those important details with us. But we have to keep in mind that we don't truly know what needs substance use is in fact meeting for a person. Only they can know that. And something I've really learned in working with people who are street involved is that people use substances for reasons that are in fact very rational. So I think about the homeless female client who uses stimulants because she doesn't have a safe place to sleep at night. Or the person who suffered a back injury 20 years ago and has no access to primary care, doesn't have documentation, and is using opioids. Just important to think about the realities of substance use for people who are very marginalized. When we give clients the latitude to really set their own goals, it can be an effective way of kind of rebuilding relationship after the many people who have been very traumatized at the hands of mainstream healthcare. So these feelings of disempowerment and alienation and judgment are in fact real, and we are trying to rebuild that relationship. Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
Yeah, sorry. Just two quick things I just add. I think Kelly's done a really good job of summing up a lot of the client-centric approach that we offer. I like the fact, Kelly, that you draw attention to it kind of ties back to what we were talking about with the non-judgmental perspective, viewing behavior in context, right? Behaviors that might seem, irrational or self-destructive or whatever, when client gives you enough of the context, enough of their story to view the behavior in its proper context, it can seem more reasonable or rational. And I think that is an important component of adopting a client-centric approach. And the other thing I just want to add really quick to you is that, as much as it is a crucial goal to have clients implement their own goals in order for their own care, for their own treatment, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no role for staff or providers in that as well. Like, we can provide information that can temper and ground client goals. We can help set client expectations about what would be maybe reasonable or possible, but we help refine and elaborate these goals, but we always have to let the client set them. So yeah, so moving on from client-centric care, we're going to talk a little bit about incrementalism, and it's actually it's a really useful segue, because once a client has has enough trust in the therapeutic relationship to begin setting goals, to begin confiding in you about what they want and what they would like to see happen in their lives, incrementalism is the sort of approach that we use to pardon me, is kind of the approach we use to assess, to kind of to gauge progress, right? So a lot of substance use treatment, Kelly was saying, advocates for total abstinence. And if it's not total abstinence, it's any kind of like absolute totalizing goal. And that kind of thinking, as Kelly highlighted, can be very disempowering for people who use drugs, because anything sort of adherence to the goal is viewed as failure. And as harm reduction advocates, we kind of reject this kind of binary thinking. And instead, we want to help clients formulate small-scale, realistic goals that we can subsequently build on and acknowledge success when it occurs. So I think this point is especially relevant in the context we're seeing of the ongoing overdose crisis, where we're seeing a lot of heavily adulterated drugs appearing in the street supply, and the clients are using and accessing. Even very small steps, incremental progress is meaningful in that context, right? Because the context people are facing, that they're living in, is so dangerous and so toxic that any kind of progress is actually meaningful. The very act of accessing harm reduction services is meaningful in that context, because it shows a desire to want to stay safe. It shows a desire to want to improve one's healthcare outlooks, right? So that's something that we can definitely build on. And so once a client has divulged enough that we can begin talking about treatment goals, we can begin talking about what they want to see, we need to celebrate and acknowledge the incremental progress clients are making on the goals that they set. And like Kelly said, viewing the treatment to care process as a progression of small goals is a useful way to conceptualize our relationship, because again, it offers opportunities to build. It's more helpful and realistic to think of the care relationship, as an ongoing process that's going to have peaks and valleys, like ups and downs, as opposed to just like a unidirectional moving in a single direction with a single goal. Progress is always going to be relative, and incremental process is achieved in negotiation with the complex needs that we're talking about, the kind of societal obstacles that clients can face. Celebrating what might seem like a very small or minor victory kind of demonstrates that we take these self-identified obstacles seriously, that we're making an attempt to engage with the lived reality of our clients. And that can go a long way to making sure the client feels seen or heard. And, that incremental progress too also serves as like a proof of concept, right? A lot of the clients we deal with are people who have had disempowering experiences with other kinds of healthcare service delivery models. And when we acknowledge and celebrate the small goals that are made relative to the overarching kind of goals that clients set, it makes people feel like they have more buy-in to the kind of the care relationship. It shows that they're not powerless to improve their own situations, and it demonstrates that it's kind of possible to succeed on your own terms, and that can encourage participation even in the face of setbacks. So it's more an incrementalist kind of approach is more conducive to viewing care as that ongoing process that's going to have its ups and downs, its good days and its bad days. And so when we do that, it encourages client buy-in and drives that overarching goal we were talking about earlier of keeping the clients coming back. So the last kind of principle I want to take a look at here is consistency. And we've kind of split consistency into a two-pronged principle. So we have consistency in delivery and consistency in interaction. So, an overarching theme that we've heard from our talk today thus far is that the lives of people with complex needs, people who use substances, they can often be really unpredictable, especially when you're kind of economically and socially marginalized, like a lot of our clients are. So we try to aim to deliver our services in a consistent and reliable manner, so that people, who may not have a lot of stability in their lives, who may not have a lot of things that they can count on, they can kind of, as much as possible, they can kind of count on our services being there and accessible when needed, when the needs arise. So that's
Yeah,
consistency.
absolutely, Pat. I thought for a moment how well this ties into client-centric care, right? So
Mhm.
low barrier care as well. So we, for example, will not say to a client, okay, your appointment with our nurse is at 9:30 p.m. on Tuesday. Instead, we'll say, you know what, the nurse is going to be here Tuesday from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. If you can make it during those hours, we would love to see you.
Definitely. Yeah. All right. And that's the consistency in delivery, right? Like a client will then know, like, yeah, those are the nurse hours. I can, I may not know what's going to happen for me on Tuesday, but I have a framework I can work from. And I know that, I can access the services I need in that time, regardless of what else may come up in my life, as opposed to a fixed, say, appointment time, which can, things happen and that can be difficult to keep sometimes. The other factor I want to kind of look at in terms of with regard to consistency is consistency in interaction. And this is, just the idea that the way we deliver our services is going to be relatively consistent no matter who the client is. There's no kind of preferential or special treatment. Clients know that, they know what the expectations are for behavior. They know they know they will always be treated fairly and have their needs addressed when they access services with us. And that's a really important um, principle as well, because it demonstrates that no one, the services we provide are going to be accessible to everybody, regardless of maybe you're having a bad day, maybe you're not as you know you're not feeling as positive about your care. You can still know that you will be able to access services that are going to be delivered like consistently and fairly as well. And one of the things that comes up with regard to trying to deliver services consistently, whether with regard to consistency in delivery or consistency in interaction, is that a lot of the factors that are going to influence this are going to be out of our control sometimes, right? Like when you look at things like program funding, staffing levels, staff burnout, these things are going to be largely out of our control as individuals. But it's still important to communicate to clients that if there's going to be any kind of potential disruptions to service or any interruptions, we want to try and be like a relatively reliable presence in our clients' lives. And, this goal is aspirational because, like I said, a lot of times there are factors that we can't control. But, clients should still have the understanding that
Apologies, everyone. Just one moment while we get our presenters back online. Be right with you in just a second. All right, great. I see that you've rejoined, Kelly. And let's just see if we can get Pat back online as well. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. It'll just be another moment while we get our presenters back online to continue the presentation. So Kelly and Pat, if you'd like to turn your microphone and cameras on, there we are. Welcome back. I'll bring us back to where we were in the slides in just one moment.
Sure.
There we are. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Kind of apologize for any service interruption while talking about consistency in service delivery. Not sure what happened there. But yeah, as I was saying, the consistency goal is going to largely be aspirational. There are factors that are going to be out of our control, but we just kind of want to impart to clients that our services are going to be relatively stable, relatively reliable, and that regardless of who they're dealing with or speaking with, the service delivery is going to be relatively consistent. And I think that is, especially when we're dealing with folks who have a lot of upheaval, a lot of chaos and instability in their lives. That's something really important that we've heard from our clients. They identified as something that is like a reassuring thing, knowing that, services are going to be accessible to them when they need them, and we're going to meet them where they are.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. I think too, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the absolutist black and white thinking that our society sort of has around drug use, people really can internalize this, and so I find that people are often have a lot of self stigma and are very hyper focused on being treated differently from others. So I think it's so important, again, as Pat said, to be consistent in your interactions with people. The person who's having a terrible day and is being gruff with you versus the person who's very persistent. We aim as much as we can in harm reduction to have our service delivery be the same regardless of kind of where you're at on that day. So I hope that this has been somewhat useful. So we've tried to talk about a client-centered, harm reduction-based, and low barrier care model in some kind of principles that hopefully we can operationalize, and I think we can use these principles in a lot of delivery of a lot of different kinds of health and social services. So Pat, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how this cycle works.
Yeah. So I mean, like I said, the bulk of our talk today has been looking at like kind of the 5 principles that guide our low barrier, client-centric, harm reduction-based approach. And these aren't just like, nice principles or like philosophical principles, whatever, but they are like things that we try to implement in our interactions with clients. And I find the most useful kind of way to think about them has been a kind of holistic model where the principles kind of flow into each other, right? So as you develop a relationship with someone, you can see a progression of these principles that kind of underlie the therapeutic or care relationship. So, from the beginning, right, the non-judgmental approach is going to set the tone for all our future interactions with this hypothetical client, right? Like when they know that we are a non-judgmental presence, that we're not going to make those kind of absolutist judgments about the behavior that Kelly just highlighted, people are more likely to come to us with knowledge and concerns and ideas they have. And that kind of feeds, so we can see how a non-judgmental approach then kind of feeds into the knowledge sharing we were talking about, right? If somebody knows that we are going to be a non-judgmental presence, they're going to be that much more likely to come to us with their questions or their concerns. So once some client has done that, once they know we're non-judgmental and that we're going to be a good source of relevant information, that's when we can begin to start setting client-focused goals. We can then ask, like, you have this knowledge now. You know that I'm a non-judgmental presence. What can we do to support you reaching the goals that you want to reach? So once you have number 1 and 2, it kind of feeds reasonably well into the number 3, whereas the client begins to trust us enough, trust our perspective, and trust our knowledge enough that they can begin to share their goals with us. And then we can start looking at how we can implement them, how these goals can be achieved in their lived situation. And that then feeds logically, right, enough into incremental progress. There's going to be good days and bad. There's going to be peaks and valleys, ups and downs when the client is trying to reach the goals that they've set. And so when we acknowledge incremental progress, that then again feeds back to a non-judgmental approach. We're not going to judge a client when they have the kinds of setbacks that are going to be inevitable to a care relationship like we've been talking about. So you can see, like, I find like it's a useful way to view these principles as like a flow chart, right? A consistent flow that comprises the the client-centric harm reduction-based model that we've spent the last 45 minutes or so talking about. The principles do feed into each other. They're not just abstract ideas, but they are ways that can underlie all our client-staff interactions.
Thanks, Pat. And you may notice that consistency isn't in the diagram. That's because consistency should be consistent. Haha. background principle in everything that we deliver. We really do strive to implement consistent service delivery and consistent interactions throughout all of the different kinds of services that we offer at Street Health. And just to sort of conclude, we have developed this model and this manner of interacting with clients over many years because we found that this is what works for people, right? So this is what leads people to keep coming back to our services. It's what leads people to open themselves up and be vulnerable enough to share their stories with staff and to ask for support. So practical and hopefully something that's been broken down into a way that you may be able to imagine applying to your own client interactions. So that just about concludes it. I think we'd be more than happy for anyone here to reach out to us over email. Again, we work at Street Health at Dundas and Sherbourne in Toronto, very available via email. I really hope that this discussion of harm reduction today has piqued at least some people's interest. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the context in which we work in and the context in which we wrote this presentation in. So Canada is undergoing a toxic drug crisis. There's been 42,494 people who've died since January 2016, 22 people a day dying across Canada. I would really like to urge people to think about challenges and changes that we might make to the status quo, because the status quo is really not working. Harm reduction, we have found, really works well for the clients that we serve, folks who are homeless, street involved, very, very marginalized. It is a practical approach that we do in broader society take with many risky behaviors. We don't demand abstinence from people in many other facets of their life. So I would hope that some of us can understand how harm reduction is a way to address some of the devastation that we're seeing out there among people who use drugs.
Yeah, and I really echo what Kelly said, that we have focused on substance use given the our area of expertise and the topic of the of today's conference. But yeah, this kind of model does present opportunities to work with people who engage in lots of stigmatized or risky behaviors, right? It's not necessarily something that is just inherent to substance use, but can address a lot of risky or stigmatized behaviors.
All right, thank you. I think if there are any questions, now would be a good time to take them.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, if anyone does have any questions, you can put those in the chat. Right now, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Is that clear to everyone?
I'm having difficulty hearing, sorry.
Sorry, just checking. Can you hear me better?
I can hear you better, yeah.
Great. Right now, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. If you do have any, you can pop them in there. For now, I had a question I wanted to ask, if that's okay. So my understanding is that in the Moss Park, Allen Gardens neighborhood and extending into Regent Park, there are fewer safe consumption sites available currently, and some are closing, like the one at Moss Park as the new transit station gets built. What could you say to primary care providers about that fluctuating access to service and what role they can play?
I think Kelly knows the neighborhood a little better than I do.
Yeah, I think something, so I'm going to try to be not too political here, but I think something that's very, very unfortunate about the model of supervised consumption sites that we have in Ontario is that it's up to the social service to decide that they want to open the service, and then they apply. So there's really no effort to, what I think would work best would be if we had a variety of services geographically spread out, and that look a number of different ways. So, for example, the service at Street Health is very small, very low barrier. I know there are other services that are larger, open longer hours, but I would encourage people to advocate for a more planned approach that would serve a wider both geographical area and, in fact, we do not have any 24-hour services in Toronto still. So the last supervised consumption site, I believe, closes around 10 or 11 p.m. So I would encourage people to advocate to the Ministry of Health to have a look at their consumption and treatment services program and expand it to actually meet people's needs. Unfortunately, we ask people to never use alone for their own safety, but it is easier to tell people that than sometimes for people to actually follow through on that advice. So at the very least, have naloxone, make sure your friends have naloxone, make sure that you're prepared to know what to do in case of an overdose. But yeah, the situation with supervised consumption sites not meeting people's needs is unfortunately very real. There's also a 1-800 number called the National Overdose Response Service. So even if people are kind of put into a situation where they have to use alone, they can call this number. They're great folks. They will wait on the phone with you while you use. And then if something happens to you, if you don't respond, then you get to choose in advance what the step they take is. So they'll either call 911 for you or call a trusted contact and let that person know what's going on. But that is one option for people who don't have access to sites or who are, for other hours of reasons of inaccessibility of hours or geography.
It's a great resource. Thank you. And we have a couple of questions. Elena Cox asks if you could give a real life example of the process being put into practice. So being non-judgmental here, a success story of building trust with a client.
Yeah, I can jump in here if you'd like. So one of the things that has been like a fundamental part of kind of articulating this model has been both Kelly and I worked for long periods in supervised consumption sites. So, for me, a lot of the theory, whatever behind this, comes out of having worked in an SCS for a long time. So I think like a lot of times, like the kind of model we talked about underlies a lot of client staff interactions in the SCS context. So, from my own experience working in a supervised consumption site, we had a client who was homeless, a daily fentanyl user multiple times a day, who began accessing the SCS just out of concern, had seen friends overdose, had seen friends die. So was started to use the SCS on a regular basis for most of their substance use. I mean, obviously, as Kelly was saying, there are pressures with regard to hours and time. So sometimes they couldn't access the SCS when needed, but they would try to use it as much as possible. So we built a relationship with them over a period of months to where, and this is something we didn't really touch on, but we began to offer the service of drug checking. And I just want to send a shout out to Toronto's drug checking service, because I think they're probably one of the most important harm reduction tools that have come along in the last 10 years or so. So when we began offering drug checking services, this client wanted to start getting some of the drugs they were using on a daily basis tested. And so when a lot of new and unfamiliar drugs started showing up on the test results, it provided an opportunity for us to, learn about some of these substances, convey that information to him. And, once he knew he had a resource base he could work from, he began, accessing we were embedded in a community health center at this point, began accessing other services at the health center, which still he'd come to us to use on a daily basis. And, we began to look for care options that would be applicable to him. And, this was in the earlier days of the Safer Supply program. So we managed to get him onto a Safer Supply program. Again, there were interruptions in his progress there. There were a couple of times that he missed appointments or, used fentanyl out in the community when the SCS wasn't available. But again, like we tried to situate that in the context of, the ongoing collaborative care relationship we had with him. And eventually, like over the course of about a year, he got stable on Safer Supply, would come twice a day to access his safer supply injections. And I haven't seen him in a little while, but yeah, he was stable for over a year and a half on safer supply, going from daily fentanyl use with, you know, the corresponding overdoses to being stable on safer supply and getting into housing. So, you know, that was sometimes, you know, we experience setbacks too with clients and our relationships with them, but that was one case where you could kind of see that progression through the cycle. And yeah, he ended up in a much better place.
Thanks. And a question from Laverne Arthur. Can you suggest a summary article or resource that summarizes the principles of harm reduction?
Oh, geez, that's a good one. I feel like, you know, that, and Kelly can correct me if I'm wrong here. I feel like it's still kind of a philosophy that's, it's still kind of an emerging philosophy. It's becoming more mainstream in a lot of ways, but I don't know that anyone's written like the comprehensive like harm reduction document or philosophy or something at this time. I would say, gosh, I'm trying to remember some books off the top of my head.
There's a good book, a really great book actually, on the history of harm reduction called Undoing Drugs by Maya Salovich.
Oh yeah,
Spell her name in the chat if you want. So she talks a little bit about the emergence of this as a philosophy of care and talks a bit about the history of needle exchange, supervised consumption, things like that. I would recommend that book. But yeah, I would agree that in terms of like a manual of principles, it has yet to be written. The Harm Reduction Coalition, National Harm Reduction Coalition in the States has a pretty great website. There is also, I would actually recommend people look at the drug policy, what are they called? Drugpolicy.ca, Drug Policy Coalition in Canada, for more information on the intersection between drug laws and people's experiences. But that Maya Salovich's book is a really good book to just get a description of the history and kind of emergence of this way of thinking about substance use.
Any other questions? All right. Well, we've only got it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Pat.
Sorry, I just want to look something up really quickly. Yeah, I can also recommend the work of Susan Boyd. She's written some really good stuff about the history of drug laws and such in Canada that has been really influential on a lot of folks in harm reduction.
Okay, great. So if there aren't any other questions, we've just got 3 minutes left anyway, so we're pretty much at the time point. Kelly, Pat, was there anything you wanted to say before we close?
Thanks for the opportunity. Like, it's always nice to get a chance to preach the harm reduction gospel a little bit. So I appreciate the opportunity. And like Kelly said, both of us are available for email if anyone's got any follow-up questions or just want to discuss anything. Like, I'm happy to chat.
Yeah, and just to say, like, we're always really interested in collaboration. I think sometimes there can be like a bit of a sense that treatment is oppositional to harm reduction, but really we're working on kind of helping people meet their own goals. So I think that's a universal principle, and you know, all of us hopefully have the best interest of folks at heart, and we know that there's a lot of people really struggling right now. So yeah, we would encourage collaboration.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, great. Well, if there aren't any questions, I think we can release everybody a whole minute early to get to your lunch. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated.